I have recorded a specific sound in my field journals hundreds of times. The sharp, hollow clink of a shovel hitting sun-baked, sterile earth at 6:12 a.m. It is the acoustic signature of a systemic biological foreclosure. I have spent 14 years observing individuals kneeling beside their raised beds, their hands stained with soil that feels more like crushed chalk or industrial ash than living earth. They stare at a tomato plant that never managed to set fruit, its leaves yellowing and brittle in the peak of July, looking as if it had given up on them personally. I've seen the frustration in their eyes as they look at their dirty hands. Then, at the half-used bag of premium fertilizer leaning against the garage wall, with the nursery receipt still tucked in their pocket like a reminder of a bad investment. When I multiply that scene by the millions of backyards I've studied across this continent, the data reveals a haunting truth. It is not the gardener who is failing. It is the entire circuit that was engineered, from the soil up, to leave you with no way out but a permanent dependency on the next plastic bag. In my own research plots, I maintained an experiment for over a decade that my neighbors considered a sign of absolute psychological erosion. I had a hole in the center of my garden bed with a segment of PVC pipe, about 12 centimeters in diameter, protruding from the ground and sealed with a plastic lid. My neighbors thought I had lost my mind. They would look at that pipe and shake their heads. My gardening friends eventually stopped asking about it altogether, assuming it was some failed plumbing project I was too embarrassed to remove. But what none of them knew was that this seemingly ridiculous tube was generating, in total silence, the most valuable plant food on the planet directly in the root exchange zone. It did this without me ever touching a shovel, without the back-breaking ritual of turning a compost tumbler every 3 days like clockwork, without me hauling 26-kilogram sacks from the store, and without any complex calendars, measurements, or expensive chemical activators. I was simply applying a nutrient transfer protocol that entire civilizations in Mesoamerica had mastered long before the modern industry ever invented the word fertilizer. The Aztecs did not read NPK labels on plastic bags. Those ancient cultures understood something we have been forced to forget: that beneath the surface operates a complex, living motor. Millions of earthworms processing organic matter, building soil structure, and releasing nutrients in biochemical forms that no modern factory has managed to fully replicate. They didn't attempt to domesticate these creatures or move them into expensive, specialized bins. They simply built their growing systems, their milpas, around them and stepped back to let biology work. Centuries later, Charles Darwin spent the final 4 decades of his life obsessed with these exact creatures. He considered his book on earthworms one of the most important works of his entire career, proving with clinical data that earthworms are the true architects of fertile soil. Not the rain, not the sun, and certainly not the irrigation systems we buy. Yet, in my investigation of history, I found this pivotal finding was buried on purpose, to make room for a different kind of commerce. At the conclusion of World War II, the industrial infrastructure that had spent years manufacturing high-intensity explosives suddenly found itself with a massive surplus of synthetic nitrogen and no enemies left to bomb. They needed a new customer, and they found it in the agricultural fields. Overnight, the entire conversation about growing food was hijacked. We stopped talking about biological systems you cultivate and started talking about chemical saturation. The industry didn't need you to understand how soil actually works. It needed you to believe that fertility comes from a bag. This is the trap you have been caught in. I've analyzed the current pricing of this dependency in my logs. €19 for a 5-liter bag of worm humus at any garden center. It is a generational scam, paying €19 for the waste of an animal that lives for free under your feet because someone decided decades ago that the fertility of your soil had to pass through a cash register first. This is not commerce, it is the visible symptom of a fraud that has been operating in silence for generations. An earthworm doesn't generate a monthly invoice, doesn't require refrigerated transport, and doesn't expire on a shelf. An earthworm simply works for free while you sleep. And that, for those selling bags of synthetic nitrogen every spring, is a direct threat to their business model, so they sold you another story. They told you that fertility comes in 3 numbers, printed on a bag: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, the famous NPK ratio. It sounds scientific, It sounds precise, as if someone had solved the equation for you. But what those 3 numbers don't tell you is everything they destroy along the way. In my laboratory records, I record the application of synthetic fertilizer, not as feeding, but as a biological assault. When you scatter those soluble granules, you are triggering an artificial greening. Within 48 hours that looks like success, but underneath the surface, something is dying. Those nitrogen salts hit the soil solution like bleach hits a petri dish, creating an osmotic shock that shrivels microbial life. The bacterial colonies that were quietly mineralizing nutrients for free are wiped out. The hair-thin fungal filaments of the mycorrhizal network, what I call the wood wide web that connects roots to trade phosphorus for sugars, are scorched on contact. They retreat, they fragment, and they die. When that network vanishes, your plant is left alone and disconnected, 100% dependent on the next dose you administer from a plastic bottle. It is the perfect business model, a customer who must return every single season to buy what the soil used to provide for free. And it doesn't stop with the chemistry. We were told that tilling was preparing the earth, that we needed to break it and leave it loose before planting. But in my observations, the plow is performing invasive surgery on a patient that only needs rest. It destroys the aeration tunnels that earthworms spent months constructing, kills the anaerobic microbiology by exposing it to oxygen, and leaves the surface bare for the sun to char what little remained alive. Then come the herbicides to clean what regrows, and with them goes the last remnant of cover. Your soil becomes sterile and compacted after 2 rains. And you find yourself back at the store buying bagged topsoil. Literally buying back the earth you were convinced to destroy with their own products. Every bag of substrate, every bottle of liquid fertilizer, every bag of packaged humus is proof that the system didn't fail by accident. It worked exactly as it was designed, to kill the free biology so that you depend on the paid biology. And the most perverse part is that you, meanwhile, believed the problem was your thumb, your climate, or your lack of experience. The problem was that you were put into a circuit where every solution you buy generates the next problem you need to solve by buying again. Now, if the industry spent decades erasing earthworms, fungi, and the most basic logic of living soil from the map, the obvious question is, what would happen if you stopped following their rules and started listening to the ones that already existed before the first bag of NPK arrived? I want you to imagine that someone told you there is a distribution network beneath your feet right now that is older than any road, more precise than any drip irrigation, and completely free. You would probably think it's a fantasy. But the problem isn't that it doesn't exist. The problem is that we've been stepping on it and paving over it for decades without knowing what we were destroying. When you pour synthetic fertilizer into the soil, it's like flooding a telephone exchange with salt water. There is a language down there, a constant conversation between roots, bacteria, and fungi. Roots aren't passive straws that absorb what they find. They emit chemical signals, small pulses of acids and sugars that say exactly what they need and when they need it. Fungi extend hyphae thinner than a human hair, connecting different plants like fiber optic cables. A tomato plant stressed by drought can receive phosphorus from a nearby bush through this network, not out of charity, but through exchange. The plant delivers sugars it manufactured with photosynthesis, and the fungus transports phosphorus. It is commerce, not magic, a subterranean barter that works without intermediaries, without packaging, and without anyone paying a cent. This is where the worm humus enters the gear as a piece that fits perfectly. When a worm processes organic matter, it doesn't just grind scraps. Its intestine is a micro-laboratory where specific bacteria multiply and humic acids are synthesized. They generate auxins and cytokinins, plant hormones that tell roots to grow faster, ramify, and resist. A study in applied soil ecology proved that minute amounts of this material outperformed conventional fertilizer in germination and early growth, not because it had more chemicals, but because it reactivated the conversation. It returned the microphones to a room that had been silent for decades. During those years, we were shouting at plants with massive doses of nitrogen, drowning out their own subtle signals. It's like trying to have a conversation in a crowded nightclub where the chemical noise covers everything. The mycorrhizae retreated, the network died, and the root was left waiting for the next spoonful of plastic bottled nutrients. But that network isn't gone, it's just dormant. And that ridiculous PVC tube in my garden was the switch to turn the exchange back on. The humus that the earthworms deposit through those holes doesn't just feed the plant. It inoculates the soil with the operators that we're missing. Bacteria that fix nitrogen from the air, fungi that extend their filaments again, and acids that soften compacted earth so water starts staying where it matters. It's not a gardening trick, it is the soil's original protocol. The most uncomfortable thing of all is how little you need to reactivate it. Here comes what no one tells you. The moment you stop hustling in your garden is when it starts working for real. You've believed for years that a productive garden demands more work, more products, and more hours on your knees under the sun. But that tube in the bankhole operates with inverse logic. You give the tube the scraps you were going to throw away, the banana peels from breakfast, the core of the apple your child left half-eaten, the lettuce leaves that got sad, this morning's coffee grounds, and in exchange, you get the most biologically active fertilizer in existence. No cost, no shovel, no smell. It's almost insultingly simple. Those scraps release chemical signals as they decompose, acting as an underground beacon for every worm in a considerable radius. They arrive, process the material, and drag fresh humus directly to the roots. You don't need to direct them. They've been doing this since long before agriculture existed. You just return the raw material to them that the supermarket convinced you was trash. And here is the part that challenges every productivity hack you've ever heard. You don't have to be consistent. You don't have to feed the tube every day like a demanding pet. Every 3 or 4 days is fine. If you go on vacation for 12 days, the system won't collapse. The worms will just disperse, work the surrounding soil, and return. When you throw in the next handful of scraps, it's that simple, that undramatic. No industrial machine allows that kind of abandonment and continues producing when you return. This system does because it is living biology. The only way to sabotage it is to put in what doesn't belong: meat, fish, oils, or heavy sauces. These materials decompose through a bacterial route that worms find toxic and drive them away. Excessive citrus can unbalance the microbial chamber, and commercial vegetables, sprayed with pesticides, can poison the very population you are trying to build. If it's raw, vegetable, and clean, it goes in, everything else out. Look at what just happened. I didn't ask you to buy anything. I didn't ask you to learn a complex technique or dedicate an entire weekend. I asked you to stop throwing in the trash what your soil has been waiting to receive for years. That is all. A gesture so small it seems insignificant. And yet it is the switch that turns on an underground distribution chain that no commercial fertilizer can replicate. Less intervention, more results. Less control, more life. The soil doesn't need you to manage it, it needs you to stop hindering it. When you start to see that dark layer, almost black, accumulating around the tube and extending towards the roots of your lechugas, you are going to understand something. That changes your relationship with that little piece of land forever. But what comes after that, once the soil has awakened, is another level entirely. Tell me one thing in the comments. What is the first thing you would throw into the tube tonight? Now, imagine this. It is a Tuesday in February. It is cold. And the news has been repeating the same headlines for 4 days: supply chain fractures, partial shortages, and prices doubling overnight. Your neighbor rushes to the supermarket only to return half empty-handed, paying triple for a manojo of yellowed spinach that already looks sad. You, meanwhile, open your back door, walk 6 or 7 steps to your garden bed, pull back a bit of protective mulch, and harvest exactly what you need for dinner. No barcodes, no waiting lists, no dependency on a freight truck or a diesel price, decided by people you will never meet. That food exists because months ago you decided to trust biological intelligence instead of a tube of NPK. That difference is not luck, it is not privilege. It is a decision you made months before when you put your first kitchen scraps inside a tube that everyone considered ridiculous. Because what you built was not an irrigation system or a nice hobby for the weekend. You built a supply line that doesn't depend on a central warehouse or a corporate negotiation that will never think about your plate. And this is where it gets uncomfortable for certain business models. Every season, millions of people enter the same wheel, buying bagged soil, liquid fertilizer, treated seeds, and pesticides, only to think cultivation is difficult when things go rocketicos. But the problem was never you, it was the fact that they sold you each piece separately of a puzzle that biology solved millions of years ago, for free, under your feet. What you did with that tube was step out of that line. You let the earthworms, the fungi, and the bacteria do exactly what they have been doing since before agriculture, converting death into life. No intermediaries, no labels, no expiration dates on a shelf. And the most disturbing thing for those who sell fertilizer is that this process doesn't stop. It doesn't need annual renewal, it works as long as you keep feeding it what you used to throw away. I'm not talking about movie apocalypses, but what we've already seen. Inflation, droughts, and cut commercial routes. In these scenarios, food is the first to go up and the last to go down. The person with a living system producing nutrients at the root isn't praying for the truck to arrive. They are eating. This isn't decorative gardening. It is the quietest and most real version of sovereignty you can exercise. So the next time someone looks at you weird for that tube sticking out of the ground, smile. Because what they see is a piece of PVC. What you know is that down there is a microscopic army working 24-hour shifts to guarantee you something no supermarket can promise. Real food when you need it, with no strings attached. I have learned that the earth has not forgotten how to feed us. We have simply forgotten how to listen to the original protocol of the soil. Now, tell me something, and I want you to be honest in the comments. If the shelves were to go empty tomorrow, what is the one thing you would want? To be able to harvest from your own soil. Every answer down there is one more person who just opted out of the panic aisle for good.